My dad and stepmom kicked me out on my 18th birthday and stole my room for their new baby, but I shattered their illusion and left them begging in vain. Last week, I turned 18, and my dad unfortunately thought it was the right time to kick me out. My mother passed away when I was 3 years old in an unfortunate accident. Since then, my dad has had a long list of girlfriends and failed relationships. Even as a kid, I'd never seen him without a woman in the house. I had a nanny to look after me during the day when my dad was at work, and whenever he came back, his girlfriend at the time would be with him. He cut ties with my mother's family after her passing because he didn't see the point of keeping in touch with them. I assumed they didn't want a reminder of the tragedy, so they didn't claim custody to be able to visit me either. Growing up, it was just me and my dad, but he never seemed very interested in being a father to me. He mostly spent his time either working or hanging out with his girlfriend, whoever it was at the time. I tried hard to get along with him as a kid, but I never received any love or affection from him. He just did the bare minimum for me, so I gradually learned to expect nothing at all. That was my childhood, lonely and kind of sad. Thankfully, I still had my grandfather to keep me company occasionally. He'd visit me often and was pretty much the only family I had. Unfortunately, he couldn't take me in because my father didn't want to give up my custody for some reason. My father was cold but never cruel toward me, at least not when I was a kid, so I don't think my grandfather had enough legal reasons to try to take me away. Sometimes he'd visit me, and other times I'd go to him, but my father carefully ensured I didn't spend more than 3 or 4 days at his place in case I wanted to stay longer. My visits to my grandfather were regulated by my dad, and I still don't know why he was so finicky about it. For whatever reason, my father wasn't willing to give up my custody. Even though he treated me coldly, he still wanted to keep me around, and it still doesn't make sense to me. As I got older, I began to rebel because I wanted to spend more time at my grandfather's place. My grandfather showed me more love and affection and actually seemed to care about me beyond just the basics, unlike my father. However, my father wasn't willing to let me go. Even when I brought up how my grandfather treated me infinitely better than he did, my father would say that, at the end of the day, he's my dad, and whatever he says goes. My grandfather tried several times to get my dad to treat me like his own kid, but nothing ever changed. He also didn't let me move out to live with my grandpa. So, even in my teens, I had to continue living with my father. That was pretty much the worst phase of our relationship. Things only got worse after he met my current stepmother, Veronica, a 28-year-old woman. Veronica used to be our neighbor's niece, living with our neighbor until her company provided her with proper accommodation. Then she and my dad started going out, and they got married about a year ago after almost 8 months of dating. My dad seemed to dislike having me around but never did anything about it until Veronica came along. Then both of them turned pretty vicious toward me. Veronica had it in for me from the first day, and I had no idea why. It's not like I'd done anything to her. In fact, I always tried to be very nice to her, but she hated my guts. I guess it had something to do with the fact that I was my dad's son from his previous marriage, and she couldn't stand that I was still around, as it was a reminder that my dad had been married before. That's just my theory of why she hated me so much. Maybe she didn't need a reason to hate me, and that's just the kind of person she was. I don't know. The bottom line was that she hated me, period. My life got a lot worse after she started dating my father. She'd make it a point to be as horrible to me as possible whenever we were in the same room. She practically treated me like a housekeeper and would make me do all the chores, even though we had a maid. My dad never said a word against it. I felt like Cinderella in my own house once she moved in. Not only that, but she also convinced my dad to stop giving me money for going out with my friends, which had never been an issue before. She convinced him I was old enough to get a part-time job and learn to make my own money, so there was no need for my father to spoil me. I had to get a job to be able to go out with people and pay for stuff, which was a much easier alternative than begging my dad to treat me like a human being. It was horrible because Veronica seemed bent on making my life a nightmare at my father's house. I couldn't wait for the day I could go to college and move out of that place. I told my grandfather about how I was being treated at my father's place after Veronica moved in. He said he'd talk to my father about it and do something, but things never changed. After a while, I gave up hope that my grandfather could make things better for me. If it hadn't happened so far, I didn't think it would happen in the future either. I would vent to him, and he'd listen patiently, but that's all that happened. Things never changed. After a while, I just accepted that I had to deal with my dad and Veronica until I could afford to move out. Then, about a week ago, on my birthday, I was planning to go out with my friends and celebrate my 18th birthday by buying a couple of beers and having a fun night. I'd been saving up money for a while so I could splurge. But then my dad and Veronica decided they had terrible news to give me just to ruin my birthday. On the morning of my birthday, They told me they had something important to discuss. For a second, I thought it might be something good, like they remembered my birthday or were going to offer to pay for college. Instead, they told me I needed to leave the house and find another place to stay. They said they were evicting me since Veronica had found out a couple of weeks ago that she was pregnant, and they wanted to use my room as a nursery for the new baby. My dad told me they had come to this conclusion after a lot of thought and would rather I not beg or act pathetic to make them reconsider because that would ruin their happy mojo. Veronica told me that since I was an adult now, I needed to look out for myself, and this could be the start of something great. She tried her best to sound concerned and hopeful, but all I heard was a conniving snake trying to get me kicked out of my house. I tried to tone down the panic I was feeling and decided to be rational with them because I knew crying, kicking, and screaming wouldn't get me anywhere with these people who had no sympathy for me. So, I told them that legally they couldn't evict me without notice and that they needed to wait a couple of months until I could find a place for myself. I honestly had no idea what I was talking about, but I'm pretty sure a law like that exists. My dad didn't fall for it, though. He told me he had everything worked out with his lawyer already and highly doubted I had enough money or resources to come after them legally, which was true. I didn't have either of those. So, I suggested I could pay rent for as long as I lived with them. Veronica shot that down instantly, saying rent wasn't the problem and that she just didn't want unnecessary people to deal with while pregnant, so I needed to vacate the house to give her a peaceful pregnancy. I was grasping at straws, but I made a last attempt and asked my dad if I could move to the basement or something because I was pretty desperate. He still said no. He worked in a bank and made a decent income, so much so that Veronica had quit her job to be a stay-at-home wife. I knew money wasn't the problem. After some bickering, I realized I couldn't change their minds. They wanted me out at any cost. Now that I was an adult, they could kick me out without legal repercussions, and I couldn't do anything about it. So, I accepted defeat, went up to my room, packed my things, and left. I had no idea if my grandfather would be able to take me in or not. One major reason I hadn't moved in with him against my dad's orders was because he wasn't very financially stable. He'd been a high school science teacher but was now retired. He'd had an unfortunate gambling addiction when my dad was in his 20s, which messed up his savings, and he relied heavily on my father. He could barely support himself, so I had no idea how he'd support me as well. That's why I hadn't moved in with him earlier. To be fair, it wasn't like my grandfather was starving. He lived modestly, and I could get used to it, but I didn't want to push him into a corner. Without thinking much, I headed to my grandfather's place. Once there, I told him what my father had said. For about a year, I'd been trying not to worry about this, but deep down, I knew this day would come. I also had to worry about how I would pay for college, as I was supposed to start in the fall, just a couple of months away. Thinking about all that overwhelmed me, and I started crying. That's when my grandfather told me he'd had enough and had seen enough. It was time to do what he should have done years ago. I didn't understand what was going on, and he didn't tell me, but he went into another room to make a phone call. I tried to eavesdrop but could barely hear anything, so I gave up. After almost an hour and a half, my grandfather came out and told me I had nothing to worry about anymore. I could live with him now, and I wouldn't have to worry about college either. I tried to ask him what was going on, but he told me it was none of my business right now. He sounded really upset, so I didn't push further. Then he told me to go enjoy my day with my friends as I'd planned because my 18th birthday wasn't a day to sit at home and mope. Now that things were all right, I had nothing to worry about, so I could go out and enjoy myself. I decided to make the most of my day, now that my problem seemed solved, and went out with my friends. I kept my phone on silent for the evening in case my dad called and had something to say. I didn't want him to ruin my evening like he'd ruined the rest of my day. I didn't find out about his texts and calls until I got back to my grandfather's place, which wasn't until almost 10 at night. I don't know what got into him, but it appeared he had suddenly developed a conscience and was begging me to come back. I didn't reply immediately but waited until the next morning to say I wouldn't be coming back. I didn't hold back and told him the reason I wasn't coming back was because he'd never treated me well. Now that I finally had a chance to be happy, I wasn't going to give that up, especially because Veronica was even worse than him. I couldn't bear the thought of going back to living with him again. He'd controlled me for a long time, but now that I was an adult, I could choose where I wanted to live, and he had no right to tell me to come back, especially not after how he and his wife had kicked me out just the day before. I'd only been worried because of my grandfather, but now that he was okay with me living with him, I wasn't going to go back to my dad under any circumstances. After I sent those texts, I received one long text back from my father, and it was a pretty sad one. He told me he'd thought about things in private and came across an old photo album of me in his office, which reminded him of all the promises he'd made to my mother. It felt like he was letting her down by putting Veronica and the new baby over me. He wanted me to give him one last chance to be a better father this time because the news of the new pregnancy had spooked him, which is why he'd done whatever Veronica asked without a second thought. Now he realized he shouldn't have kicked me out and wanted me to come back desperately. I didn't reply to that text because I knew he was trying to manipulate me, but I didn't understand what he was going to gain from this, and I still don't get it. It's been a week, and he's been texting me every day, constantly reminding me of a couple of good times from my childhood and telling me how sorry he is for how he treated me. Initially, I thought he was trying to manipulate me, but now I just don't know anymore. I tried to talk to my grandfather about it, but he just told me not to fall for his act and seemed very put off by his son's behavior. I feel kind of sorry for my dad because now he's finally trying to be nice to me, but I don't want to go back anymore, and I feel like a jerk for some reason. The rational part of my brain knows this is what's right for me, but a part of me wants to go back and see if my dad will actually change or not. I don't know why, but he's trying to be a good father and make me come back, even though he knows Veronica won't like it. He's willing to put up with her outbursts just to get me back, and I feel like I owe him a second chance. Yesterday, he texted me and said he was willing to beg on his knees for me to come back if that's what it would take. I felt sorry but still didn't feel sure enough to reply, and it's making me feel guilty. So, am I the asshole for not wanting to go back to my father's house even though he's begging me to return? I'm not going back to my dad's house, and I don't think he meant any of what he said. I just discovered that the reason my dad's been begging me to come back has nothing to do with me but more to do with his lifestyle and maintaining it, if you catch my drift. I sat my grandfather down and told him all about how my dad was begging me to come back, and I still didn't want to go. It was making me feel like a horrible human being, and I was feeling very guilty about it. I tried to talk to him about this before, but he just told me not to fall for it and left it at that. This time, I felt like I needed to get all of this out of my system, even if he wasn't any help. After hearing me out, my grandfather got really serious and told me he wasn't allowed to talk to me about this, but he felt it was finally time I knew. He told me that ever since I was a kid, my dad didn't have to pay for anything to do with me. It was all my mother's family contributing and funding my upbringing. Now that I'd been kicked out of my father's house, my grandfather had spoken to my mom's family and told them about how I was being treated, which is why they decided I must now live with my grandfather. They were pretty pissed off at him as well for allowing this to go on for so many years and never saying a word about it. But now they insisted I live with my grandfather. My dad didn't know about any of this and found out only a couple of days ago after he kicked me out. My grandfather told him about it. My grandfather was the bridge between my mother's family and my dad and had been passing the money to him that my mother's family sent. My dad always assumed it was my grandfather funding everything, and my grandfather never corrected him because he knew my dad didn't like my mother's side and wouldn't take money from them, which would, in turn, affect me because my dad was never willing to spend money on me. So, he kept it a secret and pretended he was giving my dad money to bring me up. My mother's family was pretty rich, so it was huge amounts of money, which is probably why I went to private school for so long. My dad would never have wanted to spend money like that on me. Unfortunately, after my dad married Veronica, he started keeping those funds from me and forced me to get a job just so I could afford basic things like going out once in a while and buying new clothes and shoes I desperately needed because I'd outgrown the previous ones. I mean, I know it's not exactly like he was depriving me of food or anything, but it still felt pretty bad. My grandfather still didn't tell my mother's side anything because he was afraid of the consequences and didn't know what they would have to say about it, so he kept it all quiet. But once I got kicked out, he realized he had to speak up for my sake and finally told them the truth. I was mad at my grandfather for never telling me about any of this, but he said he had no option. My mother's family wanted it to be a secret. Apparently, they didn't want me to know they were the ones paying for everything because then I'd probably want to meet them, and they didn't want to meet me, not because they didn't like me, but because I looked too much like my mother, and they couldn't bring themselves to do it. So, it was more of an emotional reason than a practical one that stopped my grandfather from telling me anything. I was a little mad at him for never stepping up and telling them how my father and Veronica were treating me, but he said he was afraid that if he spoke up, my mother's family would intervene and have me taken away from them, and then he'd never get to see me again. It was an irrational fear, but he was still afraid of it. We talked things out, and I have to admit I'm still trying to process a lot of it, but at least I know the truth now. I'm definitely not going to fall for my dad's manipulation because he's only trying to get me back so my mother's family will continue sending him the money, and he can use it for his benefit. I knew his new persona was too good to be true anyway, so I'm not too upset about any of this. The decision to block my father's number came after I uncovered the unsettling truth behind his desperate attempts to lure me back home. It had only been a few days since I took that step, a choice born out of necessity rather than malice. Unable to reach me directly, he resorted to using Veronica's phone to send messages, each one dripping with a pretense of concern that I could no longer trust. One evening, My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, and without thinking, I answered. It was Veronica. Her voice, laced with exaggerated sorrow, pierced through the line as she accused me of being cruel to my father. She claimed my absence was tearing him apart, and she couldn't bear to see him suffer, especially in her condition, as if her pregnancy were some debilitating illness rather than a choice they'd made together. Her words felt like a performance, a carefully rehearsed act to guilt me into compliance. I wanted to hang up the moment I recognized her voice, but a nagging curiosity held me back. What could she possibly say to justify their actions? As she rambled on, her mock sobs grated against my nerves, and I felt a familiar wave of frustration rise within me. I'd spent years enduring her hostility, her calculated efforts to make me feel like an intruder in my own home. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me now. "I'm not interested in talking to you," I said firmly, cutting through her theatrics. Undeterred, she handed the phone to my dad, who began to speak, his voice heavy with what I now knew was false remorse. Before he could weave another tale, I interrupted. "You can drop the act," I told him. "I know the truth, and I'm not falling for it," he stammered, claiming ignorance, but I wasn't having it. "Maybe my mother's family can explain it better," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. Then I hung up and blocked Veronica's number, too. The act of blocking them was more than just silencing their calls. It was a declaration of my independence, a refusal to be pulled back into a life of neglect and manipulation. There was a certain satisfaction in it, a quiet triumph in standing my ground. When I shared this with my grandfather, his weathered face broke into a proud smile. "You handled it well," he said, his voice warm with approval. His words meant more to me than I could express, a small anchor in the turbulence of my emotions. For years, he'd been my rock, the one person who showed me what family could mean, even when my father failed too. His support gave me the courage to keep moving forward, to carve out a path that was mine alone. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on the family I'd never known, my mother's side, who had quietly shaped my life from a distance. I'd learned from my grandfather that they'd been funding my upbringing all along, a fact my father had hidden from me. The revelation stirred a mix of gratitude and longing. I needed to meet them, to thank them for their unseen generosity, even though I knew it would be hard for them. My grandfather had warned me that I resembled my mother too much, a painful reminder of their loss. Yet, the desire to connect with them outweighed my fears. I sat down with my grandfather one evening, the weight of my decision heavy on my chest. "I want to meet them," I told him, my voice trembling with both determination and uncertainty. "I need to know who they are, to thank them for everything they've done." Convincing them wasn't easy. My grandfather spent hours on the phone, his voice low and earnest as he pleaded my case. I could see the toll it took on him, the worry etched into the lines of his face. He'd always been the bridge between me and my mother's family, carrying their support to me while shielding them from the truth of my father's neglect. I felt a pang of guilt for putting him in such a position, but he waved it off. "You deserve this," he said simply. After what felt like an eternity, he came to me with good news. They had agreed to fly down and meet me. The anticipation was overwhelming. I'd seen pictures of my mother's parents and her older brother, their faces frozen in time, smiling in moments I'd never shared. Meeting them in person would be different, real, raw, and unpredictable. With only a couple of days to go, I was a bundle of nerves and excitement. I didn't know what to expect, but I held on to a quiet certainty. No matter how it unfolded, they would love me, and I would love them too. When the day of the meeting arrived, my heart raced with a mix of hope and apprehension. My grandfather, ever my steady guide, was by my side as we walked into the restaurant where we'd agreed to meet. The air felt thick with anticipation, and my palms were sweaty as I scanned the room for unfamiliar yet familiar faces. Then I saw them, my mother's parents, their eyes soft with emotion, and my uncle, who looked startlingly like me, only older, with the same crooked smile I'd seen in my own reflection. The moment our eyes met, tears welled up, unbidden and unstoppable. We all cried, a quiet, shared release of years of separation and unspoken grief. The other diners glanced our way, their curiosity evident, but we didn't care. In that moment, it was just us, a family reunited against all odds. The initial awkwardness melted away as we settled into conversation. They asked about my life, my interests, my dreams, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly seen. I told them about my love for music, my plans for college, and the small joys I'd found in my friendships despite the challenges at home. Their questions weren't perfunctory, they listened with genuine care, their faces lighting up as I shared pieces of myself. My grandmother reached for my hand at one point, her touch warm and grounding, and I felt a connection that transcended the years we'd been apart. My uncle, with his easy humor, teased me about our shared traits, joking that I must have inherited his knack for getting into trouble. The laughter we shared was like a balm, soothing the wounds of my past. As we talked, they revealed that my college fund was secure, something they'd planned long ago but had forgotten to mention to my grandfather. The news washed over me like a wave of relief. College had loomed as an impossible hurdle, a dream I wasn't sure I could afford. Knowing they had my back, that they'd been looking out for me all along, filled me with gratitude I could hardly put into words. We lingered at the restaurant for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. They shared stories of my mother, her kindness, her stubborn streak, the way she'd light up a room. Each story was a gift, a piece of her I could hold on to. I felt her presence in the warmth of their smiles, in the way they looked at me with both love and sorrow. We parted with promises to stay connected. They insisted we'd meet every month, whether I flew to them or they came to me. The thought of building a relationship with them, of having a family that truly cared, was a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. As we said our goodbyes, my grandmother pulled me into a hug, whispering, "You're so much like her, but you're you, and we love you for it." Those words stayed with me, a reminder that I was more than the pain of my past, more than the neglect I'd endured. Reflecting on it now, I'm filled with a quiet hope. The meeting wasn't just a reunion, it was a new beginning. My grandfather's pride, my mother's family's warmth, and my own resolve to move forward have given me a strength I didn't know I had. I'm not the scared kid who left my father's house on my 18th birthday, unsure of where I belonged. I'm someone with a future, with people who care, and with a truth that sets me free from the manipulations of the past. The road ahead won't be easy: college, building these new relationships, navigating the lingering pain of my father's actions, but I'm ready to face it, one step at a time.